Further up this time.
I did, yes. Yeah. Oh, the sound was hopeless last time. And
These get posted on the ASA site.
for the moment, they're just being posted on YouTube, but eventually they will get moved to the ASA site.
So for the first one, I could just type in Laura's name and...
You could. That was the worst one, though. It was good talk, but the sound was so bad on it. I'm not
too far back.
I was too far back and there's too much interference. I had to pump up the gain to hear anything. So then every cough and sneeze and wheeze, it just became kind of... The second time around, I had to be closer. Don't be shy. Stick the mic right in their face. Yeah.
Still left. Wandering around all day with like luggage truck, luggage on wheels.
Yeah.
There is a textbook that will be circulated in the venue, and it is for you to sign also because we are celebrating not too far from now the 50th anniversary of the anthropology. So if you see this book and you feel inspired to what you are taught, you are very welcome. Welcome to the closing plenary. My name is Claudia Merli, and together with Paolo Cottis, I am responsible for the conference team Experience in the Fields of Experience. With this thematic focus, we wanted to assess the current state of affairs around the traditional long-term fieldwork as central to the practice and identity of social anthropology. At the same time, we wish to invite explorations of the experience of fieldwork and different field sites, and how this very peculiar kind of intersubjective practice shapes the existential trajectories of both anthropologists and the people they meet, often creating lifelong relationships. But we also title the reflection on other aspects of fieldwork and the aesthetics of sociality and the human-non-human relations. As we finalize this theme's description, we knew that we wish one specific anthropologist to be our thematic plenary speaker. I'm very honored to introduce our thematic plenary speaker, Michael Jackson, who is Distinguished Professor of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. He carried out fieldwork in Sierra Leone among the Turanko, in Australia among the Warlpiri of the Northern Territory and the Kuku-Yalanji of Queensland, and in Europe, specifically in the UK, in Denmark and the Netherlands, with African immigrants. He is author of over 20 anthropology books, as well as 12 novels, memoirs, and poetry works. 2 more works are now in press: Philosophical Anthropology in a New Key, and The Work of Art and the Elementary Forms of Religious Life, both with Columbia Press. He has relentlessly sustained an extraordinary engagement, both thought-provoking and path-breaking, with continental philosophy and American philosophical traditions, most notably with existential phenomenology and pragmatism. The latter led to his elaboration of radical empiricism as ethnographic method. I will conclude this introduction and take no more time from the plenary lecture by quoting a few lines from Professor Jackson's work that we find resonate vividly with other discussions and plenaries during this conference, and particularly in relation to the anti-immigration climate that we are experiencing in the UK in the aftermath of Brexit, as well as elsewhere in Europe. He and many of us in this lecture theatre have migrated from one country, their native country, to another, often from one continent to another, to pursue knowledge and to embed ourselves in different fields, testing our personal as well as professional horizons. In his preamble to the Wherewithal of Life from 2013, Jackson writes, "Rather than treat the migrant as a single figure, an interloper, anomaly, or alien in our midst, I view the migrant as exemplifying a universal aspect of human existence. Either we are moving or the world is moving, about, under, or above us. To cite the slogan so often seen on vehicles in West Africa, no condition is permanent." Professor Jackson's presentation today is The Varieties of Temporal Experience. Please join me in welcoming him to the program.
Thank you, Claudia and Paolo and the ASA for inviting me to be here. I think this is the first time ever I've delivered an address in the United Kingdom, so it's a nerve-wracking experience. Just as we reinvent ourselves many times in the course of our lives, sometimes becoming strangers to the people we once were, so anthropology has undergone so many changes in the course of its life that our intellectual forebears would hardly recognize the subject as it stands today, and would undoubtedly be astonished by the range of life worlds our discipline now encompasses. As Marilyn Strathern remarked in 2012, social anthropology can seemingly inhabit almost any quarter of life. Given these transformations in theoretical fashions, professional jargons, and empirical subject matter, it would be foolish for anyone to predict the future of our field, let alone claim that his or her particular research might shape it. This does not, however, inhibit one from hoping that the future will take one course rather than another. My hope is that anthropology will give more serious consideration to the critique of what Theodore Adorno called identity thinking, a mode of thought that assumes that a person's behavior can be explained by reference to his or her espoused belief, and that tends to reduce everything a person thinks, feels, or does to some pre-existing idea or ideal. What social scientists tend to call causes or reasons are often post-facto rationalizations of actions whose source cannot be unequivocally identified. And what many anthropologists assume to be ways of being are actually ways of thinking whose ontological status is context-dependent and inconstant. Adorno's negative dialectics proposes that there is always more to life than is covered or contained by the concepts, words, and ideas with which we represent it. Yet academics typically organize their discourse around preconceived and ontologized categories: gender, ethnicity, class, culture, religion, that gloss over individual variability in order to define entire groups or populations in terms of a single invariant trait. There is a troubling similarity, therefore, between this culturalist reduction of reality to representation and the racist reduction of a whole person to an article of his or her clothing, or the color of his or her skin, or the invocation of religion, patriotism, or even human rights in explaining actions whose causes and effects are as elusive as they are complex. The focus of my talk today is the gap between our cultural representations of temporality and the extraordinary variety of our experience of being in time. A problem posed by Edmund Leach 55 years ago, when he asked how we come to have a verbal category of time at all, and how that category links up with our everyday experience. My approach to the problem is to bracket out conventional notions of the differences between history and historicity, history and biography, history and myth, in order to explore, in a phenomenological vein, the indeterminate relationship between objective and subjective modes of apprehending being in time. While historical inquiry may establish the true identity of Jesus of Nazareth, or the time of his birth and death, it must be remembered that whatever such research brings to light, the truth of Jesus is to be found in the hearts and minds of individual believers, none of whom will share exactly the same experience of him. Consider too James Joyce's great novel, Ulysses. The novel chronicles the meanderings, musings, and meetings of Leopold Bloom in the course of a single Dublin day, 16 June 1904. Though Joyce took great pains to ensure that his descriptions of Dublin were historically accurate, the title of his book makes it clear that Bloom's voyages were also mythical. Nowhere is this clearer than in the passage where Bloom ponders the relation between his age and the age of Stephen Dedalus. After convoluted calculations that begin with the fact that, quote, 16 years before, in 1888, when Bloom was of Stephen's present age, Stephen was 6, we are drawn back to the mythical time of Methuselah and to the question of what events might nullify these calculations, namely, quote, the cessation of existence of both or either, the inauguration of a new era or calendar, the annihilation of the world and consequent extermination of the human species, inevitable but unpredictable. Whereas the historian surveys the past from a detached perspective, analysing sequences of events, identifying causes and effects, remarking continuities and discontinuities, and constructing precise chronologies, historicity draws attention to our immediate experiences of being in time and the way the past, present, and future appear to us. From this phenomenological perspective, temporality connotes both our immediate experience of being in time, as well as the metaphorical and mundane ways in which we conceptualize that experience. To evoke Walter Benjamin's notion of the now, Jetztheit, our lives unfold in a force field, Kraftfeld, wherein traces of the past and anticipations of the future combine and commute in ever-changing ways. If, as Michel de Certeau suggests, modern Western history essentially begins with differentiation between the present and the past, we might say that temporality covers experiences in which such differentiation is irrelevant or has been lost. Long ago events come so vividly to mind that they seem to have just happened. Time hangs fire in a moment of danger and speeds up in the face of an approaching deadline. An aroma or passage of music instantly transports us to another time. Spellbound by a story, we lose all track of time. The future fills us with dread, and we hesitate to bring children into the world. At the same time, historical events, the Holocaust, the crucifixion of Christ, the killing of Imam Hussein, the Atlantic slave trade, the Fukushima nuclear disaster, the devastation of a traditional way of life, come to figure more compellingly in one's experience than events that occurred yesterday. In all these instances, chronology collapses, and only a sense of duration endures. Writing in her great memoir about those who survived Stalin's Gulag, Nadezhda Mandelstam observes that it was a feature of almost all the former camp inmates I met immediately after their release. They had no memory for dates or the passage of time, and it was difficult for them to distinguish between things they had actually experienced themselves and stories they had heard from others. Places, names, events, and their sequence were all jumbled up in the minds of these broken people, and it was never possible to disentangle them. In his work on the testimonies of Holocaust survivors, Lawrence Langer speaks of this as a movement from chronology to duration. One's life is reduced to a series of events that have no connection to the life one lived before the Holocaust or to any life one may hope to live thereafter. Quote, testimony may sound chronological to an auditor or audience, but the narrator, a mental witness rather than a temporal one, is out of time as he or she tells the story. This sense of being out of time is, of course, a corollary of the sense of being nowhere, or getting nowhere, or going nowhere. Similar effects may follow a return visit to a place one left to begin a new life elsewhere. In Denmark earlier this year, I happened to pass the apartment on the corner of Norrale and Ehonsgade, where I lived 10 years ago. The neighborhood seemed so unchanged that I felt that if I entered the building and went up to the first floor, I could walk in on my family and we would be as we once were. This anachronism was compounded when I boarded a bus to Blanchot, which passed the Assistance Cemetery where Søren Kierkegaard was buried, and moved on into the depths of Nørregaard. I had an uncanny sense of having been miraculously transported from middle-class Copenhagen into a shabby Middle Eastern city, its streets lined with shawarma, falafel and kebab cafes, halal butchers, Punjabi greengrocers, currency exchange, hair salons, and used clothing stores. In fact, the street was known locally as Little Arabia, almost 30% of its population comprising immigrants from Pakistan, the former Yugoslavia, Turkey, Somalia, or the Middle East. These incongruities recurred the following evening when my wife and I visited Emmanuel Murmila, his wife Nana, and their daughter Alice Maria in their apartment in a Copenhagen suburb. I had become friends with Emmanuel when ghostwriting his story in 2011-2012. Now, as a decade ago, Emmanuel's experience of being a Ugandan in Denmark continued to be bedeviled by a lack of fit between his harrowing past and his uncertain future. When I asked Emmanuel about the work he had been doing last year, or previous year, making and delivering ice cream, he said that the company had closed and that he was now acquiring an international truck driver's license. He had passed the Danish exam and would take the EU exam in a few days' time. After years of being stuck in permanent temporariness, he felt he was on the move and finally going somewhere. And he liked the idea of being in command of a powerful truck, seated high above the traffic, a master of his own domain. But there was one obstacle, however, that he was still struggling to get around. A psychologist who worked for the driving school had become curious about him. Sensing that he was far better educated than any of the other trainee drivers, and fluent in Danish, despite being a foreigner, she had accompanied Emmanuel on test drives, prying into his life, and repeatedly asking him questions to which he was prepared to give only minimal answers. Given his experience of doors closed in his face when it was discovered that he was African, or overqualified for the job, or educated at an Islamic university, Emmanuel feared that if the psychologist learned details of his Ugandan childhood, she would diagnose him as suffering from PTSD or suspect him of planning a terrorist attack. I kept asking myself, he said, what relevance did her questions have for driving a truck? Did she think I would load it up with explosives and destroy the Danish parliament? Or was it simply a friendly interest? At that moment, Emmanuel was in two minds, in two places, and torn between two temporalities. The now was a force field filled with contending experiences, questions, possibilities, and images. Remembering the bullying he had experienced as a boy, his initial reaction to the Danish psychologist's questions was to fall back on the coping strategies he had learned early in life, to hide one's feelings, to keep one's thoughts to oneself, and build smoke, as he put it, to distract the persecutor and avoid a confrontation. But he knew that Denmark was different. Here you were expected to bare your soul, even to a stranger, to share intimacies, and eschew prevarication. People are always prying into your life, Emmanuel said. Always asking me what jobs I'm doing, whether I like to work, how much I earn. It's too much, really. For Emmanuel, the now was riven by incompatible demands that not only reflected different cultural modes of interaction, but different places and different times. The Uganda of his difficult childhood, and the Denmark in which he still hoped to have a future. And I was reminded of how often in our contemporary lives we struggle to find time to do everything we want to do, from raising our children to writing our books. The terms past and future are clearly relative to our social, emotional, and ethical preoccupations in the here and now, rather than any externally defined timeline. In his great triptych, Pig Earth, the English writer John Berger recounts how he was walking in the mountains in the French Alps with a friend of 70. As they walked along the foot of a high cliff, the French peasant remarked that a young girl had fallen to her death there while haymaking on the alpage above. Was that before the war? Berger asked. In 1833, his friend replied. E. Evans Pritchard relates a similar anecdote in his classical ethnography of the Nua. How shallow is Nua time, he writes, may be judged from the fact that the tree under which mankind came into being was still standing in western Nualand a few years ago. And as an exclamation mark at the end of the sentence, as if we should be amazed at the possible kind of stupidity or inability to calculate time of the Nua. And I think the exclamation mark is telling, because it suggests that Evans Pritchard has not been able to overcome a Eurocentric assumption that pre-literate people conflate mythology and history because their only means of reckoning time, through counting back 10 to 12 generations, creates the illusion that, as he puts it, valid history ends a century ago. So we're very close to those anthropologists who speak of societies without history. Rather than see history as valid and myth as illusory, Hayden White, inspired by Michael Oakeshott, emphasizes the artificial and literary character of both genres. More importantly, perhaps, he turns from the question of their verisimilitude to a consideration of their practical use. As a store of accumulated experience or accepted facts, tradition may be drawn upon to warn against repeating past mistakes, to give legitimacy to present practices, to teach lessons to the young, or lend weight to one's opinion. Although from an objectivist standpoint, the past has a causal effect on the present simply because it is prior, from a phenomenological standpoint, effects may precede causes, and to all intents and purposes bring about the past. Thus, when a resentful younger brother in Sierra Leone complains about being a slave to his elder brother's will, or an unhappy wife refers to herself as a slave in her husband's household, or a 16-year-old schoolgirl tells me that anyone who does not try to be educated will be just like a slave, we glimpse not only how the historical past, in this case domestic slavery, is strategically and rhetorically deployed to explain quite different social and biographical circumstances, but how these contemporary allusions to slavery effectively bring the phenomena back into being. This was also brought home in Margaret Mead's famous rap on race with James Baldwin in 1970, when Baldwin repeatedly reminded Mead that if history were the past, it would not matter. But for we African Americans, history is not the past, it's the present. Slavery is not a historical fact, it is a lived experience happening now. Clearly, our sense of being in time has inner and outer horizons, and we move continually and contrapuntally between them. William James observed that experience is double-barreled and admits of no absolute division between the experiencing subject and the object of his or her experience. Experience encompasses the irreversible reality of aging and the inevitability of death, as well as fantasies of rejuvenation and rebirth that fly in the face of these facts. While young lovers may feel they have all the time in the world, the old may quail at the thought of time's winged chariot hurrying near. The gambler may lose all sense of time, taking refuge in a zone in which the tribulations of his or her everyday life momentarily disappear from consciousness. But being in the now is an unstable state, and at any moment one may be brought to one's senses, repossessed by one's dismal past, or overwhelmed by grim thoughts of one's immediate future. Whether one's life is regulated by circadian rhythms, phases of the moon, the rising and setting of stars, the cycle of the seasons, the swing of a pendulum, the rate of radioactive decay of carbon-14, or cesium second, lived time encompasses more than is measured in these ways, and it is this more that a phenomenology of temporality seeks to describe. Varying subjective responses to the same phenomenon tend to reflect what a person is thinking, feeling, and doing at any given moment in time. Evans Pritchard observed that the newer pastoralists have no word in their language equivalent to our word time as something that can be squandered or saved. They do not experience their lives as a fight against time, or as requiring coordination with an abstract passage of time, because their points of reference, he writes, are mainly the activities themselves. Evans Pritchard speaks of ecological time to capture the difference between the monotony and routine of the dry season and the more intense activities, frequent feasts, dances, and ceremonies of the rains. In the modern West, waiting is sometimes associated with a sense of having no future, of having too much time on one's hands, while hyperactivity is often taken to be a sign of vitality, like the businessman in Antoine Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince, who was so busily engaged with matters of consequence, counting the stars, that he feels himself to be someone of much greater importance than a curious child or stargazing dreamer. Just as our sense of duration is constantly varying in relation to our immediate purposes, so our experience and discourse switch constantly from past, present, and future reference. Although Karanko stories are framed as taking place once upon a time, skilled narrators make recurring allusions to real places in real time in order to give these fantastic tales relevance to contemporary issues. And when recording dreaming narratives during my fieldwork among the Walpurgi, I was constantly struck by the way narrators spontaneously slipped from third to first person, as if these epical stories made sense only when integrated with the narrator's autobiographical experiences of the sacred sites and ancestral journeys referenced in the myths. We make history in the same measure that it makes us, and we inevitably make or remake the past in the light of our present concerns. The art historian and anthropologist Avi Volberg spoke of the afterlife, Nachleben, of the past, by which he meant the uncanny perseverance of images, gestures, expressions, and ideas over time and across different societies. Thus the snake in Australian Aboriginal myth, Aztec cosmology, ancient Greek healing rites, Minoan art, and Pueblo dance suggest an enduring human preoccupation with rain and fertility, health and healing, and life after death. Although the exact threat to life's continuous and abundance may differ from time to time and place to place or person to person, death is always only a matter of time. And both death and time are inextricably connected with narrative and ritual. For in narrating or enacting events that occurred in the past, we can transform the experience of passing into nothingness into an experience of passing into another state of being. Nevertheless, it is important to stress that different regimes of historicity may be found in every person and every society, and that context is what determines which will be brought to the fore and which will be backgrounded. For example, traditional Australian Aboriginal conceptions of the dreaming suggest a timeless and circumambient condition in which ancestral, animal, and contemporary beings are continually morphing one into the other. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that the dreaming is not as ancient and unchanging as it appears to be, and contemporary conceptions of the dreaming often reflect the legal demands of reclaiming traditional land under the terms of Australian land rights legislation, in which case the dreaming tends to be conflated with past time and firstness in order to confirm prior ownership and belonging. Because variations within a population or person are as great as variations between populations or persons, one cannot define either cultures or individuals in terms of a single prevailing modality of time consciousness, despite the allure of such anthropological binaries as hot, cold, stationary, cumulative, and cyclical linear. In West Africa, divinatory and musical talents often come to a person in the course of a feverish episode of illness, usually during early childhood. The jinn that enter a person's life in this manner can be summoned at any time thenceforth and bestow oracular power. But when a diviner explains how he acquired his skills, he may refer back to such childhood events, while acknowledging that the jinn are timeless beings, and that during a divinatory seance, the distinction between what happened in the past and what is occurring now is experientially annulled. The same is true of ancestors. Summoned in a sacrifice or appearing in a dream, an ancestor is nominally and palpably present. At other times, the same ancestor is out of sight and out of mind. In other words, consciousness oscillates between quite different ways of apprehending one's being in time, and it would be foolish to reduce temporality in any one society or any one person to a single static mode of experience. Rather, we need to speak of polyontologies or multiple regimes of historicity across and within cultures, as well as within the consciousness of a single person. As easily as he'd slip from acoustic to electric guitar, or guitar to harmonica, Bob Dylan would move from realist to surrealist imagery. And so it was with time. In one song singing that his name it is nothing, my age it means less, yet invoking history as exact testimony. Oh, the history books tell it. They tell it so well. The cavalry charged, the Indians fell. Only to declare, I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. Which seems logically impossible, yet phenomenologically makes perfect sense, at least for me. Consider the place of dreams and dreaming in traditional Africa. During my field work in northern Sierra Leone, villagers would sometimes recount vivid dreams in which a deceased family member appeared to them. This was not construed as remembering. In fact, there's no canonical word which exactly translates our idea of memory or remembering. It's a mental event. Not construed as remembering or dismissed as a figment of the imagination, again, there's no word for that, but taken as evidence of the existence of the dream figure elsewhere in present time. My friend Sarah Koroma explained this phenomenon of tokoi, literally dead thing, or the action of the dead, as follows. The dead are always there. They see everything. They know exactly what is happening. The dead are your subtle cause. Sarah prays to his ancestors every morning, asking them to beg God to open a path so that he will be blessed before greeting his late father. My dad is still alive, Sarah explained to me. It's just that I am not seeing him. I only see him in my dreams, like once a month or 2 or 3 months I see him in a dream. But I know he's around me. I have a picture of him in my room. There's one thing he never wants any of his kids to do, and that is drink alcohol. When I go out and drink alcohol, as soon as I come home and step into my room and see that picture, I have to run out of the room again. I want to go and take the picture and put it away, like in a cupboard or box, but I know I have alcohol in my system, so I cannot touch the picture. I have to wait for days to take that picture and put it somewhere, so I can walk into my room and not see it straight away. I know it's just a picture, but it's like it's him seeing me, what I'm doing, you know. You see, I've got all these beliefs. And when I stop drinking and pray to him, asking for forgiveness, I know that's the only thing I'm doing that my dad's unhappy about. It is not that Sarah's belief, as he puts it, eclipses his knowledge of his father's death, or lessens the grief he feels over his father's passing. Rather, the conviction that his relationship with his father remains vital to him bolsters his spirits in a foreign environment. He lives in London, where he is often racked with guilt at having left his natal village, abandoned his birthright, and sought a new life in England. While it may be logically fallacious to infer that the force of an experience proves the existence of what is experienced, Saber's insistence that his father is still alive, like Christians who speak of God as a living presence in their lives, are choosing beliefs not on the basis of their rationality, but on the basis of what the beliefs make possible in their lives. A sense of community or solidarity with others, a sense of confidence in themselves, and a sense of connectedness that survives death and separation. My thinking about temporality and historicity was inspired by my ethnographic fieldwork in Sierra Leone and Aboriginal Australia, and cross-cultural research reinforced my view that prevailing academic models of history and culture all too often imply a disparagement of non-Western ways of understanding the human condition, particularly other modes of articulating the ethical nature of our being in time. Much of my anthropological work has essayed to redress this imbalance through both pragmatist critique and a more decisively literary approach to scholarly writing. Time may not be unreal, as John Taggart famously declared, but it is so various that it is impossible to unequivocally define it. What actually happened in the past may be no less existentially compelling to a person than what he imagined happened, or dimly remembers, or deliberately reinvents in the name of creative license. At any given moment, one cannot be sure whether one is blindly recapitulating a world one had no hand in making, or actually creating a world one can call one's own. Our lives waver continually between these two extremes, sometimes moved by fates and furies we can neither comprehend nor control, sometimes appearing to be within our power to determine. Whereas some anthropologists have postulated radical differences between societies based on whether they privilege history or myth, whether they are cold or hot, changeless or changing, with or without history, a phenomenologically more faithful account of our being in time would be sensitive to the constant shifts that occur in consciousness between these different modalities of experience, and radically question our habit of defining entire societies in terms of one or other of these modes. My ethnographic research in West Africa and Central Australia has persuaded me that people create the past to the same extent that they are creatures of it. In West Africa, one's fate is determined by prenatal choices that may, however, be resisted or revoked by what one subsequently does during one's life on Earth. For Aboriginal people, the past is continually reappearing in people's dreams, hence the notion of the dreaming. In the Welfare settlement of Lajimanu, a woman called Lorna Nakamara saw ghosts in her dream, among them the ghosts of her late husband. Her husband recounted a story from the dreaming in which a certain man had abducted a woman from a distant country. The aggrieved husbands tracked the malefactor across the desert. After ambushing him at a rock hole as he knelt to drink, they speared him to death. A few days after this dream was shared, the kinsman of the dreamer initiated a ceremony in which the ancestral event was reenacted, in effect bringing the past back into the present. Traces of the past are not held in the unconscious mind. They permeate the earth itself, lying quiescent in the ground like grass seeds awaiting rain to germinate, or sperm for an egg to fertilize. Should a woman pass through one of these potent tracts of the country, that nascent life may enter her womb and quicken into new life, and the child she brings into the world will incarnate the personality of the forebear whose spirit was dormant in the country she crossed. Since this kind of doctrine that is well known in methodological literature, the denial of physiological paternity. Since a woman conceives the child out of her own womb in relationship to the animating spirit in the ground. On a journey through the desert, Nagarjuna told me of a man called Wagon Joe who had been conceived at the rain dreaming site of Varieties. In the dreaming, a certain Jamana speared his brother there in a fight to abduct one of his wives. Today, a pile of boulders is the petrified body of this man, set atop the bodies of the two wives that he tried to abduct. According to Nugget, Wagon Joe's crooked arm and pockmarked skin were scars from that primordial spear fight, physical manifestations of the kuruwai, or the traces of that place. A sensible connection between oneself and one's forebears is also felt in relation to other kinsmen. For example, a junior sibling is associated with the shoulder, jijawunu, literally shoulder belong, perhaps because he or she is often carried on elder siblings' shoulder. To feel a throbbing or twinge in the shoulder muscles may be interpreted as a telepathic sign that a junior sibling is nigh or that something untoward has happened to them. This sympathetic relationship between separated bodies is reminiscent of the phantom limb phenomenon, in which one's body appears to remember and mourn a lost member, and may be compared with our metaphors of the marriage of minds or an elective affinity between ourselves and our precursors. In this Aboriginal worldview, nothing dies. Lives pass out of sight and out of mind for a generation before reappearing, in the same way that one's ancestors in the dreaming, their earth-shaping labour done, return to whence they came, sinking wearily into the ground to become petrified forms that would, in time, be reanimated through the ritual labour of the living. This sense that body painting, dance, and song quicken the ancestral dead into life, realizing the potentiality for the past to become present again, is not only ubiquitous in Aboriginal Australia. In societies throughout history and in the contemporary world, dreams provide evidence of the continuing presence of the dead and of their power to intervene benevolently or malevolently in the lives of the living, depending on how they are summoned and how adequately they have been supplicated. Rebirth eschatologies are universal, and karmic ideas may be found in such different sources as Pythagorean and Vedic philosophy and tribal cosmologies. The Tlingit not only believe in the transmigration of souls and the possibility of the dead returning in another human or animal form, they consider every baby to be a maternal relative reincarnated. Since the dead were cremated, people may say at the time before their own birth, then ashes I was, not yet was I born. In West Africa, a dream or memory of a forebear is taken as evidence that he is still alive, albeit in another zone. A Mapuche thunder shaman assumes the form of a warrior mounted on a spirit horse and travels to other historical periods and places to gain the power and knowledge with which to combat her community's contemporary enemies, including forestry companies and settlers. In Cuba, a Congo-inspired society of affliction known as Palo enables practitioners to viscerally experience, interact with, and work with the ambient dead in order to transform the fates of the living. A person possessed by spirits in Mayotte is momentarily both himself and another. In the guise of avatars from previous epochs, people interact, debate community affairs, and hope to be healed from their personal afflictions. And in the mountain villages of eastern Naxos, I'm referring to one of the members of this conference, this work. In Greece, dreams are as vital to the recovery of the past as papyri bones and stelae are to the European archaeologist. In one dream, the Mother of God showed the dreamer people who were contemporaries of Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the icons they carried and where these buried relics might now be found. Although we in the allegedly scientific West have come to think of our relations with the ancestral past largely in terms of genetics and epigenetics, alternative interpretations of the continuity of life over time persist in popular ideas of cell memory, reincarnation, hauntings, myths of eternal recurrence, and an endless fascination with facts and photos that corroborate ancestral links. What gives rise to these theories of history, whether designated scientific or phantasmagoric? What is it about our lives that engenders or prompts these reflections on our existential embeddedness in the past, so that if these theories disappeared, they would inevitably be reinvented from the raw material of our being in time? One answer to this question is that in order to think about our immediate experience of being in the world, we need to have recourse to images, concepts, and practices that appear to be objective, not completely of us, yet not entirely unfamiliar to us. Such ambiguous forms that participate in our subjectivity, yet remain partly alien to us, include gods and spirits, the dead, exotic places, distant times, either past or still to come, and other people, real or imagined. Through these various forms of otherness, our ownness becomes thinkable and life becomes more graspable. Let me consider, in closing, an African example of temporal experience that brings us to a new understanding of the various ways in which being in time may be conceptualized and of the ethical and practical implications of those conceptualizations. For the Bang of Côte d'Ivoire, infants are said to lead profoundly spiritual lives, in part because they are reincarnations of someone who has died, in part because they come into this world not from a void, but from a rich social existence in a place that adults call Rukbe. What is remarkable about Alma Gottlieb's commentary on Bang thought is that rather than simply describe it in epistemological terms as a worldview, or ontologically as a way of being in the world, she asks a pragmatic question. What implications does such a way of thinking have, to quote her, for how infants and young children are cared for? First, it underscores the importance of reciprocal interactions between the world of one's predecessors and the world of the here and now, emphasizing that if one's present life is to flourish, then one's connections with the afterlife, which in Bang thought is the ancestral realm where we come from, must be kept alive. Second, if human lives are perpetually moving between this world and Rukbe, then the tragic repercussions of infant mortality are reduced, since children who die early will most certainly be reborn. In recognition of this continuity between contemporaries and predecessors, the names of the dead are recycled. Third, Bang beliefs imply that infants are not incipient or lesser human beings, but worthy of the same respect and attention one would accord any adult. Thus, parents are continually exhorted by diviners to give their crying child jewelry or coins. At the psychological level, Gottlieb writes, the diviner is communicating to the parents the message that the infant needs to be valued more, respected as a fellow person rather than viewed as a suffering, wordless creature. I miss my other home, a baby might be trying to communicate while crying wordlessly. Please give me something to remind me of home. In other words, infants have memories, desires, multilingual skills, and a capacity for understanding that adults ignore at their peril. Ethnography offers one of the most edifying ways in which one can transcend the limits of being born, raised, and educated in one culture, just as history can potentially transport one to another time. However, as Johannes Fabian points out, both history and anthropology have invoked past time as a stratagem for denying coevalness to our prehistorical forebears and our distant contemporaries alike, insofar as their time and our time are allegedly not one, their humanity and ours are essentially different. Yet ethnography holds out the possibility of seeing through this illusion of essential difference and identifying what is common to all humans despite appearances to the contrary. Whether fieldwork is carried out in a remote African village or close to home, through face-to-face encounters or archival records, through history or through autobiography, and whether one writes fiction or non-fiction for academic consumption or the common reader, the promise is not only that we will know ourselves as if for the first time through the other, but that we will have in the process made it more possible to live with one another in the self-same world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was truly beautiful talk. I wish we had all the time in the world for questions and discussion. And we have a bit more than half an hour, so please, we've got a difficult task for me to. I'll try to follow the order and you raise your hands. We can start taking the first questions, comments, reactions. Laura.
Thank you very much. There are more qualified people who have more interesting questions to raise, I'm sure, just as people are getting their wits together. Would you be prepared to accept that there are dominant ways of perceiving or constructing times, and those are legitimate subjects of studies for an anthropologist? Like everybody would accept, I would absolutely accept your phenomenological approach, but our consciousness of time is very, very complex and multivariate, etc., etc. However, I still think that when I think about the people with whom I've done my fieldwork, for example, there is definitely a collective understanding of time, a way of speaking about time, which is, I can talk about them in this way. Would you be prepared to accept that?
Yes and no. It always seems to me that if there is a dominant or prevailing view of time in the culture, it's because one is listening to the dominant class. the class that prevails, whose voice prevails. Or you are listening to a person who, for various reasons, which the ethnographer must fathom, is privileging a particular view of time and not accessing or articulating or admitting to other possible ways of experiencing time. So I basically kind of still want to deconstruct the idea that we can characterize entire populations or cultures in terms of one dominant prevailing sort of model of time. And even in our own society, if you look at the way that time is measured and reckoned, we have many, many ways of doing it. In the course of the day, if somebody says, do you have the time? You might look at your watch, or you might kind of say, oh God, it's time, I have to get home for dinner. I agreed to be there for dinner time. So there's always these kind of different ways of kind of understanding and articulating our being in time. And that's what I want to draw attention to. Because it's so easy to come up with a kind of political designation that one size fits all. And that's not the anthropology that I'm interested in.
Can we also speak of a culture? And so then how to legitimize it?
My answer to that question has always been the one that Levi-Strauss gives in his famous essay, Race and History. There's a point there where he says that if you do your ethnographic work well enough, you will find that there are greater discontinuities within what you call a culture or a society or a given population or a nation than there are between that grouping and another. And we forget that because most anthropological work is focused on the discontinuities between blocks and entities which we call cultures or nations or societies. And we often overlook the fact that the discontinuities or differences or variations within those groups are far greater. And that leads Levi-Strauss to this very interesting idea where he's kind of looking at the rapprochement between psychology and anthropology, where he says that if you extinguish a particular way of life, the germs of the possibility of that way of life growing up again are great, because the germ is in every human being. It's this kind of psychic unity of mankind idea. So under certain circumstances, any worldview that has been developed in the history of human time can potentially be recovered out of the kind of psychic sort of character of any one person. And that's always been axiomatic to me. That's beautifully articulated in the work of George Devereux.
Well,
Firstly, thank you for an absolutely beautiful paper. That was lovely. And I think your point about diversity within cultures is a vital one. And I think it's also true that individuals experience time in very diverse ways in our everyday experience. But what I want to ask you about is the technology of time-telling and its effect on patterning our experiences of time. Because it's such an interesting history of movement from almanac calendars through clocks and bells and into current types of technologies and artifacts of time-telling. I wonder if I could invite you to talk a little bit about how the emergence of particular technologies of time-telling has created some patterns and experiences of time.
Again, Veronica, it's a matter of emphasis for me, because it's very much like any technological innovation. I mean, that there are people who say of the digital revolution, or said of the Gutenberg revolution, that now the world is completely different. And there was a radical difference between a pre-literate society and a literate society, or a pre-digital and a post-digital, or an industrial and a post-industrial society. And you are characterizing an entire society on the basis of a single trait, namely the dominant sort of technology or mode of kind of production in that society. it's true that there are significant discontinuities and differences, but there are also extraordinary continuities. Partly because human beings are answering very much the same needs with different means, generation after generation. I mean, it's obvious. What is literacy and digital devices? What do they have in common? They're all concerned with keeping in touch with one another, communicating. Communication. The eternal issue that human beings experience. How can I maintain my sense of connectedness with others? So that's why it's a kind of yes and, or yes but kind of answer. It's the only answer I think I can give to that kind of question.
Right, so we have Caroline, Simone, and a third question up there.
My question also follows on it. She asked. Okay, so my question also was to follow on a little bit from what Veronica asked about specifically forms of experience of time which are like chronology, where in your work, in an individual's or person's experience of time, you find that there are some forms of time experience that are more powerful within the person, might even colonize the way that they feel from one to the other, over other forms of time. And I'm thinking specifically that there are some ways of experiencing time which try to stop time, for example, and that might be really powerful over ones that try to carry duration forward.
It's a great question because it raises the issue of whether a time, what we call time, is a word for something that actually exists, a phenomenon that is sui generis, or whether time is a metaphor with which we grasp certain experiences that could be grasped with the metaphor of space equally well. So that quite often I think any of us who are exploring temporality find ourselves by inevitably exploring something which we could also call spatiality. And I think this becomes very evident when we adopt a more experience-near approach. For example, if I there was a time when I made a trip to Sierra Leone. I was living in England at the time in Cambridge, and when I arrived, I felt the distance, not the spatial distance and the kind of cultural distance between Britain and Sierra Leone as a time difference. For what reason, I don't know, but I thought of time. And so I said to myself, you've just left Cambridge 14 hours ago, and your wife and your small daughter are there, and it's only a matter of hours that you were there. Why are you experiencing this as months ago? So the spatial is getting, as it were, articulated in terms of the temporal, and the reverse is often true. So I think the most radical approach to temporality is one which kind of brackets out the reality, the sui generis reality of anything that we might call time, or space, or the person. And we throw away all those kind of Kantian a priori categories. And we try to see that there are human experiences which we try to grasp in these ways. But the experiences are always, as it were, beyond that grasp. And then the problem of reification. We fall in love with the way in which we have explained an experience to ourselves. We've called it an experience of being in time. And we reify that, and then we think that there is such a thing. And that's the question that puzzled Edmund Leach. That's the nature of that original question of his.
I was just reflecting on the implications of your argument, and although in terms of what it means for writing ethnography, I think
why Hayden White's work, the great American historian, his work is very, very interesting to me because he has actually deconstructed the professionalized idea of history in the same way that some of us are trying to deconstruct the professionalized idea of culture. And it's basically the idea that we're putting the cart before the horse. We might, as it were, when we immerse ourselves in the world and struggle to grasp what it is that we're experiencing, the world that we're participating in, fall back on a word like history or culture as a way of kind of making sense of it or getting our hands on it. But if we begin there, we've precluded the possibility of the complete immersion, which will take us beyond that embarkation point that the profession has told us we must always have in mind before we set sail. It may be where we wind up, but we could wind up in much more interesting places if we allow ourselves to do so. So that if we've kind of, in a sense, presupposed the difference between myth and history, and we go to a society like in northern Sierra Leone, we will say, oh, I wonder if I can kind of extract real history from these myths that people are telling me, or whether these are non-historical, they're mythological, and this is another way of thinking about time. But if you throw away those ideas and just immerse yourself in whatever it is that is being narrated, and look at why it's being narrated, what people are getting out of it, what sense of the world they are getting out of it, those kind of questions of identifying it sort of are wrapping it up, assured. So Hayden White's work is very illuminating because this is why he says that we must learn to treat history in a literary as a form of literature. And that doesn't mean to say we make everything up, but it's like literature. It's something which is, in a sense, made up in order to kind of make our lives more viable, to make more sense of our life. But that's all it is. It's not as if we've kind of betrayed something which we can really know and really call history. Again, it's a metaphor.
One more question.
Thanks very much for a fascinating talk, and in particular for highlighting those very thought-provoking. I thought I'd just attempt to return the favour and share some lyrics from Pete Doherty in Britain, a limited song called Iceman. Similarly, sort of phenomenology and time, they go, this life, this love, this river has to end, but just for now, we have all the time.
Thank you. I mean, it's great because you've extended this kind of conversation about metaphorical nature of time. Time is a river, time is a journey, where these kind of general ideas of being in time is being swept away in the course of time and so forth. But when historians write, I mean, they can never fully abandon the vernacular metaphors. And I think it's because, you can't separate an objectivist description of time from a subjectivist one. Because the nature of the beast is that it is not one thing, that has no kind of identity. These are all our struggles to kind of identify a particular kind of mode of our being, which is, I suppose, this sense that we change, that things are always changing. And that's the Bergsonian sort of approach to time. It's really a question of the nature of change in life. The nature of life is ever-changing.
Thanks for such a thoughtful and thought-provoking paper. My question is, I'm not sure if it's a question or clarification for me really, but partly an effort to link some of the things you've been talking about, not so much to the points Laura Baird made in her opening talk, but more thinking back to her JRAI special issue on modern time. And my question really is about, partly relates to the point you made about lived time encompassing more than its measure, and what that implies for the study of modern time, also partly relating, picking up on one of his points about the way in which time is described in technologies and assemblies of people, bodies, brought together through practices. And I suppose I'm wondering whether one implication of your perspective is, it seems as though there's a difference between the sort of critical deconstruction of modern time and then the ethnographic approach that one can legitimately take to other forms of time. And I'm wondering if that is what you're saying, or whether we can also be ethnographic in the same kinds of way about modern time itself. So the ways in which so many people's experience of time is so caught up in measurements of modern time of one kind or another.
Well, it is a lot of the time. A lot of the time we're kind of checking the clock, checking our watches, and thinking in terms of the various ways we can measure and calculate time. But there are other times in the day when we're kind of out of time, or time has a very different value, and it's reckoned, it's thought about at all in very, very different terms. I mean, that's all I'm saying. And the kind of philosophical inspiration behind a lot of this kind of way of thinking, which is essentially pragmatist, comes from Richard Rorty, and who kind of pointed out in his great book, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, that there's two kinds of philosophers, generally speaking, and two kinds of ways in which we can think of anthropology by extension. One, that these sciences are edifying or they're systematizing. And he cites the great edifying philosophers as people like Nietzsche, Dewey, William James, Wittgenstein. And the systematizing ones are the people like Kant and Aristotle. Well, I think in anthropology we've got the same kind of tension between two kinds of ways of doing anthropology. The people who are more interested in edification are interested to, again, invoke Rorty's term, are interested in having a new conversation about life. Because, it's boring after a while to have the same old conversation. Talk about the same old things, the same old perspective. And quite often life itself demands that we have a different kind of conversation. Like the crisis in Europe at the moment with so many hundreds of thousands of refugees and migrants arriving on the shores of this continent demands that we act differently and think differently. We can't just go on thinking the way we've always thought. And so it's kind of alarming to see how many people try to systematize the situation as a way of kind of feeling that we've got it under control. So that's an exercise in what Adorno calls administrative reason. And so much academic work, as he points out, is very much like the work that bureaucrats do. You administer the world, and you must be systematic about the way you understand the world in order to administer it properly. But then there are other people saying, I'm not interested in doing that. I want to have a different conversation. I want edification. I want some kind of illumination, something which excites my interest, that takes me somewhere else on this issue. And this is an unresolved tension in philosophy, as he points out, as it is in anthropology. So, I freely admit that, the way I tend to work is more on the side of the people that sort of, I'm a bit bored by the orthodoxies.
I would just like to ask if you could elaborate a bit more on the implications of the phenomenological approach to time and space that you just explained to us so eloquently on the post-humanist approach and so-called ontological time that have become so fashionable these days in anthropology.
Well, I think I smuggled in a few kind of snide remarks on history topics. I don't want to sort of elaborate too much. Because, again, it's great, as I just said, for science to be constantly trying out new ways of thinking and imagining new ways of seeing the world. But I do think there's a serious philosophical error whenever one takes something which is, so to speak, a worldview, an epistemology, a way of knowing the world, and you ontologize it. You say, oh, I can infer a mode of being from the way that people are talking about the world as something which is subject to knowledge. So the ontological term, to me, to put it glibly and contentiously, undoubtedly, is basically rooted in a philosophical error. And as I said, time and time again, you can't say that people are in a particular frame of mind from daylight to dark and during the night as well. They might be when they're hunting an animal or when they're talking to an anthropologist, but sooner or later they've got to cook the meal and deal with the children and farm the ground. And this would require a different way of thinking. So to reduce people to a mindset seems to me to be a dangerous reinvention of the idea of the radical idea.
Of then?
The radical idea. It takes anthropology back into the 19th century. It's a resurrection of a Liby-Brulian kind of idea that there are certain people who are essentially radically unlike we are.
What about the post-human?
Thank you very much for the paper. I'm not even sure I dare ask this after your last comments. Actually, it's not even a question, it is a comment. I very much like how you used varying ethnographic examples. And going back to the concept of space and time, in the Andes there's the concept of pacha, which I'm sure you're more than familiar with, which is space and time, but it's bounded space and time. And they talk about pachacuti, where time can flip, the present can be the past. And I find it a very difficult concept to try to get across when teaching to students, because they just can't see space and time being together. And but we talk about space and time all the time. So when I was at Collingwood, and I asked the very nice porter, how far is it to the Sentage Learning Centre? He said, oh, it's about 10 minutes walk. And if he'd said it was a kilometre away, that would make no sense to me. But 10 minutes walk, you go, right, if I set out now, I'll get there in time for coffee. Anyway, that's just a comment.
It's a lovely example of how we're constantly kind of using different images or metaphors for articulating a kind of sense of distance or our relationship to a place, somewhere else, or a person. And it's a lovely kind of example, which I'm sure would be very edifying for your students. Because indeed, as also it makes something very familiar.
I think I've got the rather unpleasant task to say that we are almost running out of time, so two more questions. One up there.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I like the notion of paleontology because it kind of enriches popular understandings of ontology, which kind of homogenize being, in my opinion. I was wondering if, thinking in terms of paleontology, and as I understand it as being and time being context specific, to what extent does it make the individual, or maybe the event, as the unit of analysis for ethnographers? And to what extent does that pose a problem of interaction in the sense that if modalities of being and time are context-specific, what societies can emerge in this variation? And also a small comment, slash question. We were talking about Levi-Strauss and Elliot Hammond today as well, and they reminded me of a comment that House to describe cold societies, and his interpretation, understanding of it was that what Levi-Strauss meant was not societies which do not have time, but societies which through practices kind of keep time being a transcendent or transcendental condition to everyday life. And I was wondering if you noticed any practices which kind of keep time away to relate to the previous question.
Yeah. At the same time, I'm just going to respond to the first part of the question. I think it's very interesting the way we understand societies in a way that is consistent with the way we understand ourselves. That's the whole idea that the macrocosm is understood through images of the microcosm, which are much more familiar with us empirically immediate. And I think I was certainly raised in a kind of world which spoke of a person as having some kind of being a stable entity. I was constantly being told when I had divergent interests, why don't you concentrate on one thing? Or when I developed an interest in anthropology and I was already a creative writer, well, you can't be an anthropologist and a poet, they're incompatible. And nobody said, well, you can be two things, you can be three things, you can be as many things as you like, because it is in the nature of a human being to be multiple, not to be singular. But I was growing up in a culture where the idea of the singular identity was really problematic. And I think that then leads you to think of larger entities or polities in singular terms. You can't have a pluralist society, or you can't really have a society which is made up of diverse people and diverse ways of life. They all should have some kind of common ground. They should agree on one thing. And if they come from diverse regions, you put them through a grueling kind of education and socialization course in which they learn the American Constitution, or they learn American history, so that they all are Americanized. They all have this one thing in common which singularizes them, even though lip service is paid to diversity. So I think that anthropology, has to kind of accept that we are manifold beings. We're not just kind of one-dimensional beings. And this is something I brought to this conception of time. That we're in different kind of ways of thinking about, experiencing about time, all the time. And the oscillations, the switches from one to the other are often completely imperceptible. Like this, one moment the person is describing getting from place to place in terms of how long it's going to take there, the next minute they're describing in terms of where it is in relationship to some place on the map. And we're not often noticing how various the ways in which we are negotiating the world are.
Thank you very much for your talk. I thought that opened up a really interesting space. It's lyricism opened up an interesting space of reflection to me, and I'm sure for many other people here. My question kind of follows on from your last response. So if we think about narrative as a structuring technology of time, then we can think about Aristotle's foundational text, Poetics, in which narrative he outlines a model of narrative. Narrative should comprise plot, ethos, recreation, mimesis, an element of release, catharsis, notions of wisdom, releases, and of course, ethics. So I think that reading anthropological ethnographies, a lot of our ethnographies are actually influenced by this model of narrative. They contain and comprise these different components. The narrative, as you already pointed out, is pre-Aristotelian. Na is Sanskrit word. So I'd like you to talk perhaps a little bit about how dominant models of time that you've already mentioned have influenced and continue to influence the production of anthropological knowledge, and what a different type of anthropological knowledge based on an acknowledgement of different epistemologies of time might look like. With this important caveat that you've already mentioned, which I think is a really interesting provocation, this idea without reducing people to a mindset.
Yeah, I kind of I touched on this when I was talking about kind of dreaming narratives from Aboriginal Australia, because in a sense, a lot of people think that a dreaming narrative is something you can go and collect. It's a narrative that has a starting point, an ending point, and you can collect the whole thing. In fact, no dreaming narrative is ever told in its entirety. There's no such thing, no conceptualization of the entire thing. It's all sections, it's all bits that are never kind of assembled except in the academic imagination as a whole. And the same with the Bronco folktales, which I've devoted a lot of time recording and thinking about. When a folktale is told in Northern Sierra Leone, there's no Aristotelian structure to it. Because the moments of catharsis are several, and they are scattered through the narrative, and they're moments where people break into song. And they're usually a moment of impasse, and they're often three, just like in the European stories. You know, the person is going on a journey to accomplish something, and they're stopped by three obstacles that they have to overcome. And at these junctures in the story, there's a song, which in a sense holds up the narrative and increases tension, heightens kind of tension, and then it's broken as the narrative moves on. So it's a bit like the kind of narratives that you might record when you were studying migrants kind of trying to cross the Mediterranean and into Europe. There's no kind of linear narrative in which you embark from a certain point and you arrive at a certain point and the journey is consummated in some kind of magical climax. It's constant interruption, deviation, there are moments of joy, there are moments of absolute despair, of complete stillness and stuckness, and a moment of sudden mobility. So it's not the Aristotelian kind of way in which a narrative or even temporal movement can be comprehended. That's why I think it's very interesting to kind of go and look at, say, narrative time in a way that Paul Ricoeur, in his famous book, really doesn't kind of do, because it sticks very much with the Aristotelian model in that great book. So I think it's a great question. Great length to go.
Okay, well, I think we need to stop here with the question. Before you go away, wait here, Bob Simpson has an announcement, but first of all, thank you very, very much.